live again on Instagram. So if I get cut off again, Instagram, either go onto the Home Festival online page on Facebook, or I might flip it onto my page on Instagram if that's easier. So bear with us. If it happens again, we'll do that. Okay, let's get to the story because otherwise we won't have time. Are we ready then? So, open the page up and here we go. Are we ready? Oh, cried the two girls, rushing back to the table. Oh, it's too bad, sobbed Lucy. They might have left the body alone. Well, who's done it? Cried Susan. What does it mean? Is it magic? Yes, said a great voice behind their backs. It is more magic. They looked around, and there, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown again, stood Aslan himself. Oh, Aslan, cried both the children, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan? Said Lucy. Well, not now, said Aslan. You're not asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang around his hair came all over. Do I look it? He said. Oh, you're real, Oh, Aslan, cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him, covering him with kisses. But what does it all mean? Asked Susan when they were somewhat calmer. It means, said Aslan, that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a deeper magic still which she did not know. Her knowledge goes only back to the dawn of time, but if she could have looked a little further into the stillness and darkness before the time dawned, she would have read there a very different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would now start working backwards. And now... Oh, yes, now, said Lucy, jumping up and clapping her hands. Oh, children, said the lion, I feel my strength coming back to me. Oh, children, catch me if you can. He stood for a second, his eyes very bright, his limbs quivering, lashing himself with his tail. Then he made a leap high over their heads and landed on the other side of the table. Laughing, though she didn't know why, Lucy scrambled over to reach him, and Aslan leaped again. A mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, now letting them almost catch his tail, now diving between them and tossing them in the air with his huge and beautifully velveted paws and catching them again, and now stopping unexpectedly so that all three of them rolled over together in a happy laughing heap of fur and arms and legs. It was such a romp as no one had ever seen except for in Narnia. And whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all three finally lay together panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt in the least tired or hungry or thirsty. And now, said Aslan presently, to business. I feel I am going to roar. You had better put your fingers in your ears. And they did. And Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face became so terrible that they did not dare look at it. And they saw all the trees in front of him bend before the blast of his roaring, as grass bends in a meadow before the wind. And then he said, We have a long journey to go. You must ride on me. And he crouched down, and the girls climbed onto his warm golden back. And Susan sat first, holding tightly to his mane, and Lucy sat behind, holding tightly onto Susan, and with a great heave, he rose underneath them and then shot off, faster than any horse could go, downhill and into the thick forest. The ride was perhaps the most wonderful thing that happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever had a gallop on a horse? Well, think of that, and then take away the heavy noise of the hoofs and the jingle of the bit, and imagine instead the noiseless, padding of the great paws. Then imagine, instead of the black or grey or chestnut back of the horse, the soft roughness of golden fur and the mane flying back in the wind. And then imagine that you're going as twice as fast as the fastest racehorse. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided and never grows tired. He rushes on and on, never missing his footing and never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between tree trunks, jumping over a bush and briar and smaller streams, and wading the larger, swimming the largest of all. And you're not riding on a road, nor in a park, or even on the downs, but right across Narnia in spring, down solemn avenues of beech and across sunny glades of oak, through wild orchards of snow-white cherry trees, past roaring waterfalls and mossy rocks and echoing taverns, up windy slopes alight with gorse bushes, and across the shoulders of heathery mountains and along giddy ridges, down, down, down again into the wild valleys and out into acres of blue flowers. It was nearly midday when they found themselves looking down the steep hillside at a castle. A little toy castle it looked from where they stood, but which had all pointed towers. But the lion was rushing down at such a speed that it grew larger every moment. Before they had time to even ask themselves what it was, they were already on a level with it. And now it no longer looked like a castle, but arose frowning in front of them. No face looked over the battlements, and the gates were shut tight. And Aslan, not at all slacking in his pace, rushed straight as a bullet towards it. "The witch is home," he cried. "Now, children, hold tight." The next moment, the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they'd left their insides behind them, for the lion had gathered himself together for a greater leap than any he had yet made or jumped, or you may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back and into the middle of a wide stone courtyard full of statues. "What an extraordinary place!" cried Lucy. "All those stone animals and people. It's like a museum." "Hush," said Susan. "Aslan's doing something." And he was indeed. He had bounded up to the stone lion and breathed on him. Then, without waiting a moment, he whisked round, almost as if he had been a cat chasing its tail, and breathed on the stone dwarf, which, as you remember, was standing a few feet away from the lion with his back to it. And then he pounced on a tall stone dryad which stood beyond the dwarf, turned rapidly aside to deal with a stone rabbit on his right, and rushed on to two centaurs. But at that moment, Lucy said, "Oh, Susan, look at that lion." I expect you've seen someone light a match to a bit of newspaper which is propped up in a grate against an unlit fire, and for a second nothing seems to have happened. And then you notice a tiny streak of a flame creeping along the edge of the newspaper, and it was like that now. For a second after Aslan had breathed upon him, the stone lion looked just the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back, and it spread. Then the colour seemed to lick all over him as the flame licks all over a bit of paper, and then his hind quarters were still obviously stone. The lion shook his mane, and all the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair, and then he opened a great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a prodigious yawn, and now his hind legs had come to life. He lifted one of them and scratched himself, and then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding over to him and frisked around him, whimpering with delight and jumping up to lick his face. Of course, the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so wonderful that they soon forgot about him. Everywhere, the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum, but more like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing round him, and he was almost hidden in the crowd. And instead of all the deadly white, The courtyard was now ablaze with colours. Glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, reddy brown of foxes, dogs and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarfs, and the beach girls in silver, and the beach girls in fresh transparent green, and the larch girls in a green that was so bright that it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with a happy roar of brayings and yelpings and barkings and squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shouts and hurrahs and song and laughter. "Oh," said Susan in a different tone. "Look, I wonder, is it safe?" Lucy stood and saw that Aslan had just breathed on the feet of a stone giant. "It's all right," shouted Aslan joyously. "Once the feet are put right, all the rest of him will follow." "That isn't exactly what I meant," whispered Susan to Lucy, but it was too late to do anything about it now, even if Aslan would have listened to them. The change was already creeping up the giant's legs. Now he was moving his feet. A moment later, he lifted his club off his shoulder, rubbed his eyes and said, "Bless me, I must have been asleep. Now, where's that dratted little witch that was running about on the ground? Somewhere just by my feet it was." But when everyone had shouted up to him to explain what had really happened, and when the giant had put his hand to his ear and got them to repeat it all again so that he understood, he bowed down till his head was no further off than the top of a haystack and touched his hat repeatedly to Aslan, beaming all over his honest, ugly face. Giants of any sort are now so rare in England, and so few giants are good-tempered, that 10 to 1, you've never seen a giant when his face is beaming. It's a sight well worth looking at. "Now for inside of this house," said Aslan. "Look alive, everyone. Upstairs and downstairs and in my lady's chamber. Leave no corner unsearched. You never know where some poor prisoner may be concealed." And into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of that dark, horrible, fusty old castle echoed with the opening of windows and with everyone's voices crying out at once, "Don't forget the dungeons," and "Give us a hand with this door. Here's another little winding stair. Oh, I say, here's a poor kangaroo. Call Aslan. Phew, how it smells in here. And look out for trapdoors. Up here. There were a whole lot more on the landing, but the best of all was when Lucy came rushing upstairs, shouting out, "Aslan! Aslan! I've found Mr. Tumnus! Oh, do come quick!" At that moment, later, Lucy and the fawn were holding each other by both hands and dancing round for joy. The little chap was none worse for having been a statue, and was, of course, very interested in all she had to tell them. But at last the ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended. The whole castle stood empty, with every door and window open, and the light and the sweet spring air flooding into all the dark and evil places which needed them so badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard, and it was when somebody said, and I think it was Mr. Tumnus, "But how are we going to get out?" For Aslan had got in by a jump, and the gates were still locked. "That'll be all right," said Aslan, and then rising on his hind legs, he bawled up at the giant. "Hi, you up there," he roared. "What's your name?" "Giant Rumblebuffin, if it be pleased your honour," said the giant, once more touching his cap. "Well then, Giant Rumblebuffin," said Aslan, "just let us out of this, will you?" "Certainly, your honour. It will be a pleasure," said the giant Rumblebuffin. "Stand well away from the gates, you little uns." And then he strode to the gates, and bang, bang, bang went his huge club. The gates creaked with the first blow, cracked at the second, and shivered at the third. Then he tackled the towers on each side of them, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both towers and a good bit of wall on each side went thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust cleared, it was odd standing there in that dry, grim, stony yard to see through the gap all the grass and the waving trees and sparkling streams of the forest and the blue hills beyond that, and beyond them the sky. "Blowed if I ain't all a muck in sweat," said the giant, puffing like the largest railway engine. "Comes of being out of condition. I suppose none of you young ladies has such a thing as a pocket handkerchief about you?" "Oh, yes, I have," said Lucy, standing on tiptoe and holding her handkerchief up as far as she could reach. "Thank you, missy," said the giant Rumblebuffin, stooping down. Well, the next moment Lucy got rather a fright, for she found herself caught in mid-air between the giant's finger and thumb. But just as she was getting near her face, he suddenly started and then put her gently back on the ground, muttering, "Bless me, I've picked up the little girl instead. I beg your pardon, missy, I thought you was the handkerchief." "Oh, no," said Lucy, laughing. "Here it is." This time he managed to get it, but it was only about the same size to him that a saccharin tablet would be to you, so that when she saw him solemnly rubbing it to and fro across his red face, she said, "I'm afraid it's not much use to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin." "Oh, not at all, not at all. Never met a nicer handkerchief, so fine, so handy. Don't even know how to describe it." "Well, what a nice giant he is," said Lucy to Mr. Tumnus. "Oh, yes," replied the fawn, "all the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all the giant families in Narnia. Not very clever, perhaps. I never knew a giant who was. But an old family with traditions, you know. If he'd been one of the other sort, she'd never have turned him into stone." And at this moment, Aslan clapped his paws together for everyone and called for silence. "Our day's work is not yet over," he said, "and if the witch is to be finally defeated before bedtime, we must find the battle at once." "And join in, I hope, sir," added one of the largest of the centaurs. "Of course," said Aslan. "And now, those who can't keep up, that is, children, dwarves and small animals, must ride on the back of those who can, that is, lions, centaurs, unicorns, horses, giants and eagles. And those who are good with their noses must come in the front with us lions to smell out where the battle is. Look lively and sort yourselves." And with a great deal of hustle and bustle and cheering they did. The most pleased of the lot was the other lion, who kept running about everywhere pretending to be very busy, but really in order to say to everyone he met, "Did you hear what he said? Us lions. That means him and me. Us lions. That's what I like about Aslan. No side, no standoffishness. Us lions. He meant him and me." At least, he went on saying this until Aslan had loaded him up with 3 dwarves, 1 dryad, 2 rabbits and a hedgehog. That steadied him a bit. When all were ready, it was a big sheepdog who actually helped Aslan most in getting them sorted in their proper order. They set out through the gap in the castle wall. At first, the lions and dogs went nosing about in all directions, but then suddenly one great hound picked up the scent and gave a bay. There was no time lost after that. Soon all dogs and lions and wolves and other hunting animals were going at full speed with their noses to the ground, and all others, streaked out for about half a mile behind them, were following as fast as they could. The noise was like an English fox hunt, only better, because every now and then, with the music of the hounds, was mixed with a roar of the other lion, and sometimes the far and more awful roar of Aslan himself. Faster and faster they went, as the scent became easier and easier to follow. And then, just as they came to the last curve in a narrow winding valley, Lucy heard above all these noises a different noise, one that gave her a queer feeling inside. It was a noise of shouts and shrieks, and of the clashing of metal against metal. They then came out of the narrow valley, and at once she saw the reason. There stood Peter and Edmund and all the rest of Aslan's army fighting desperately against a crowd of horrible creatures whom she had seen last night. Only now, in daylight, they looked even stranger and more evil and more deformed. There also seemed to be far more of them. Peter's army, which had their backs to her, looked terribly few, and there standing were the statues dotted all over the battlefield. So apparently the witch had been using her wand, but she did not seem to be using it now. She was fighting with her stone knife. It was Peter she was fighting. Both of them were going at it so hard that Lucy could hardly make out what was happening. She only saw the stone knife and Peter's sword flashing so quickly that it looked like 3 knives and 3 swords, and that pair were in the centre. On each side were a line stretched out. Horrible things were happening over there where she looked. "Off my back, children," shouted Aslan, and they both tumbled off. And then with a roar that shook all Narnia from western lamppost to the shores of the eastern sea, the great beast flung himself on the White Witch. Lucy saw her face lifted up towards him for 1 second with an expression of terror and amazement. Then the lion and the witch had rolled over together, but with the witch underneath. And at the same time, or the same moment, all warlike creatures whom Aslan had led from the witch's house rushed madly on the enemy lines. Dwarves with their battle axes, dogs with their teeth, the giant with his club, and his feet also crushed a dozen of the foe. Unicorns with their horns, and centaurs with swords and hoofs, and Peter's tired army cheered, and the newcomers roared, and the enemy squealed and gibbered till the wood re-echoed with the din of that onset. And that is all for tonight, because now we are on chapter 17. My goodness, 17. So 1 more chapter, guys, to go. My goodness. I'm so sorry. There's lots of people on Facebook who were saying that they couldn't hear me properly. I do apologise if the sound isn't good tonight. I know lots of you can hear me. But we've got 1 more session to go. Please send me your messages. I love to read them after the sessions. We've got 1 more chapter, as I say, to go. So thank you very much for joining in. And the next session is at 7 o'clock on Thursday. Big kisses to you all. We've got here? We've got Tina and Gareth and Claire and Alana and Yvette. And we shall see you all on Thursday, Facebook. Thank you very much. And we shall see you soon. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your week. See you Thursday. And over here on Instagram, hi guys. I don't know what's going on with sound. You could hear me all right though, Instagram, couldn't you? Yeah. All little superstars there on Insta. Thank you very much. Okay then, guys. Yeah, 1 more session to go. So if you're interested and you fancy coming and joining me over on my page, Faye Tozer Smith, I am going to be taking questions straight away, I think, because it's that time. Let's put this one down and say goodnight to you guys, and I'll see you over on the other side.